I've always been interested in telling a story of Abraham Lincoln. He's one of the most compelling figures in American history and in my life, certainly from childhood, when I first was taken at 4 or 5 years old to see the Lincoln Memorial, and at first was terribly frightened by the immensity of the statue in the chair. And as I got closer and closer and closer, I was completely captivated. I felt by the comfort I found in looking at his face. There was a warmth and a safety. I felt really safe as a little boy looking at him. I never forgot that moment.
I had a very limited sense of him as a man before I began to learn about him. Like many people, you grow up with a figure that's more or less carved in stone, but the words are the living part of him. We're stepped out upon the world stage now, with the fate of human dignity in our hands.
Most people, at least in the United States, they carry with them a sense of who they knew Lincoln was in grade school, because everybody learns about the log cabin and the ascension to the presidency, but I don't think they know a lot of details about his personal life.
And I demand of you to try and take the liberal and not the selfish point of view.
I don't think there's any surprise that Lincoln ends up being a very complicated, fascinating man with incredible depth, because no one is going to do the amazing fundamental changes to this country without being a very complicated human being.
Get me 13 votes. Them fellers from Richmond ain't here yet.
More than any other single person, Lincoln helped end slavery. He didn't do this alone. Many people contributed to this, but it can be certainly argued that the man who signed both the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment made the single greatest contribution to making the end of slavery the great consummation of the American Civil War.
Slavery, sir. It's done.
Having collaborated with Stephen over quite a few years now, I would say that this movie represents an engagement with not only U.S. history, but perhaps in the present tense, as to how a leader actually has to function in order to lead, even when he has great obstacles. Team of Rivals by Doris Kearns Goodwin really provided, I think, the foundation of how to look at Lincoln and his inner circle and his family. It's very much about the imagery that is invoked in the book that I was inspired by as a production designer to try to create for the movie.
I loved everything about that book, so that was a great beginning. But reading objective accounts about the life take you so far. What becomes more interesting to me at a certain moment is to try and grow towards a subjective understanding of that man's experience. And in that case, the legacy of his writing was hugely important. You get such a sense of him through it's wonderful, not just his speeches, but also stories that he told.
Things which are equal to the same thing are equal to each other.
To get a sense of his thought and the movement through his thought towards a conclusion, that's a unique treasure, really, to have that.
We begin with equality. That's the origin, isn't it? That balance, that's justice.
I knew there had been 14,000 books written about Lincoln, but I just had hopefully the courage to think that somewhere, if I spend enough time, I'll come up with a fresh angle. So when I started, I thought I would write about Abe and Mary's relationship, and I began to see, as I was reading about Lincoln's day-to-day activities, that he was spending even more time with the members of his cabinet than he was with Mary. And then when I realized they had all kept diaries, they had all written hundreds of letters to their wives, then I knew that this is the story I wanted to tell, especially because they had been his rivals for the Republican nomination. So it allowed me to show him through their eyes in a way that hadn't been used quite the same way before.
The people elected me to represent them, to lead them, and I lead. You ought to try it.
When Doris told me during a Millennium Project that I was doing for CBS and the White House, and I asked her to come on my board, and I asked her what she was doing, and she said she was writing the story of the Lincoln presidency. And I immediately asked her, could I possibly, even before the book is written, reserve the movie rights.
And action.
With Doris's blessing and her full participation throughout the whole process, we decided to focus on one individual story, which was the ending of the war and the fight to abolish slavery through constitutional amendment. And we feel this film version of Lincoln is very true to the spirit of Doris's masterpiece.
Only with equality before the law.
Everybody on their feet applauding. This whole area here, on your feet applauding. Mark.
The very first time I had any contact with the Steven Spielberg universe was with Kathy Kennedy, who called me after Angels in America. My play had been turned into a TV miniseries by Mike Nichols and HBO. And I said, what are you guys working on now? And she said, we're working on 2 films. One is about the murder of the Israeli Olympic athletes in Munich. And the other is about Abraham Lincoln. And that's where it started, and as it turned out, I wound up writing Munich and also Lincoln.
It is highly unusual, sir.
This isn't usual, Mr. Pendleton. This is history.
Tony plunged himself into reading, as Daniel Day-Lewis did, so many books about Lincoln's life. There are so many different Rashomon-like points of view about Abraham Lincoln. And Tony took it all in.
They knew that this was going to be a process of not only taking Doris's incredible book, Team of Rivals, but also recognizing that they were going to be embarking on a history lesson to try to find where the focus might be for Lincoln's story.
Tony did an amazing job. He wrote 550-page screenplay, first draft. And I have a picture of myself sitting in my backyard, which I sent to Tony when he first sent me the script. It was this thick. It was in a huge binder, and I just sat there with a Cheshire Cat smile on my face, holding this in my hand. Before ever reading it, I knew, unless I went to HBO for a miniseries, this was not going to be a motion picture called Lincoln. It just couldn't be. So I thought that the most compelling thing that Tony had written was a 70-page stretch of the fight to pass the 13th Amendment on the floor of the House of Representatives. It had already passed in the Senate.
And over the course of the next 3 years of work, especially once Daniel came in, it became clearer and clearer to Stephen, I think, that that was the movie.
Well, we focused only on the last 4 months of Lincoln's life because we wanted to show Lincoln accomplishing something great, something really monumental, and that was abolishing slavery and ending the Civil War. However, we also wanted to show that he was a man, not a monument, and that our best hope of understanding and doing justice to this immensely complicated person was to depict him beginning and then conducting and then concluding a very, very complex action, which was the fight to pass the 13th Amendment.
What's before us now, that's the vote on the 13th Amendment. It's going to be so very close.
In such a rich way, Tony already suggested the man through his intellect, through his humor, through his melancholy, both domestically and in public office. The contrast between those 2 things, which is always something that's like food and drink to me. You see somebody whose life is lived at one and the same time in that strange paradox of public and private.
We also wanted to be able to include Lincoln's family dynamic, but only at the moments in which they actually collided with the public events that this whole story is about.
Secretary Stanton is sent over to tell you that as of half an hour ago, the shelling of Wilmington Harbor has commenced.
I think it was the right idea because it gives some focus to the character. It puts the character squarely in historical context. It's a good way to avoid the cliche, Lincoln, the cartoonish old honest Abe.
By choosing the last 4 months of the war, you get not only a beginning, a middle, and end to an incredibly thrilling question of whether the 13th Amendment is going to pass the Congress, but you also get Lincoln. You get his interior fighting with himself. You get the people around him, the people he trusts, and you get his political skills. Absolute front center stage in this battle.